Hi there, everybody. Welcome to another Greyscalegorilla podcast. I am Chris Schmidt, and I'm hosting today. How's it going, Chad?
Good.
So
Glad to be
Nick
here.
is Nick is on a trip this week, so it's going to be me and Chad. So we thought it might be kind of fun to do a breakdown, kind of maybe talk a little bit about the process of a little spot we put together for the Happy Toolbox animation that we did. But before we get to the specifics on that, is there any cool side news going on? I know you're talking about earlier or maybe late last week about some rendering stuff going on.
Yeah, there's a couple new things to talk about there. We've got lots of new versions cooking up. Arnold is now starting to tease out some new developments, new subsurface, new car paints, new shaders for doing like matte shadow stuff. I think a new version of Octane came out, and then Redshift continuously updates. I think like now they're on like an update schedule. I feel like it's like every week or every other week something's being added there. What else? Nothing major. But yeah, updates all around, which is nice for somebody like me because then I can. There's always like every week there's a like a present to waiting to be opened and test out some cool new stuff. So I like the fact that there's always something new to check out and that it's kind of always evolving, which is fun.
Just because we haven't touched on it in a little bit, where I know it's constantly shifting and it depends on what you're working on, but where would you say you are right now as far as the different renderers and which one you're kind of reaching for and for what reason?
Well, I'm sure we'll touch a lot about that because I was in two different renderers for this project that we're going to talk about, but I would say right now I'm spending 60% of my time in Redshift purely because of the speed, and 40% in Arnold because of the features and just the stability of it. But I'm doing several types of things right now, and I kind of will bounce between whichever one is working, and that'll be a huge part of this about this podcast when we get into the rendering of this project and like what all the different hurdles that I had to like overcome, I guess, even though they're not like huge, but they were very annoying. But yeah, I hope that answers your question. Like 60/40 right now.
Okay. No Octane hiding in there anytime?
No, I kind of stopped using. In fact, I didn't even install it for R19, and since because I just wasn't using it, and I left it in R18, and I haven't even installed it in R19 just because I just don't really. I get what I need out of that. If I need something fast, I just use Redshift. It's like kind of become second nature, and the shading is good, and making shaders is nice. So yeah, I don't really need it.
Yeah.
I do have actually I do have one thing. I need to get this out, but I don't know if we talked about this. I um I was talking to Mike Beeple, and he was starting to want to look at Redshift. So I was like, let me call you on Hangouts, and I'm gonna give you like a tour of Redshift, and I'm gonna like do it on Hangouts so that it'll be recorded and stuff. So we did that, like we did like an hour. I don't know if you've noticed lately, but a lot of his renders have kind of started becoming more Redshift renders. I don't think he's really calling a lot of attention to it, but most of his newer ones are Redshift. And that was after we did this video. And so I kind of walked him through and answered a bunch of his questions, and I recorded the whole thing. But the crappy thing about it is when you do these like Hangout things, they're only 720p. So I'm going to get that video out. It just kind of was like, oh man, 720p kind of sucks because I do a lot of screen share in the video and it doesn't look that great. But I'm going to put it up on YouTube anyway. It's just a matter of getting to it. We have a lot of stuff backlogged that we need to get out, tutorials and stuff.
Yep. So maybe we can get into some of the specifics of this project to start this off. Also, let's mention that we've got a couple people from the GSG Connect, the Slack channel for Greyscalegorilla customers, and where we hang out and we answer questions and see what people are working on. So they are going to be, they're going to have some questions for us later on. So let's keep that in mind. Anybody who's currently in that chat room, make sure that you get some questions ready. But we recently released on Greyscalegorilla a big old set of models from the Happy Toolbox. And they're super fun. They're very, a lot of them are clean and simple, a little bit stylized, playful. They're kind of like children's toys as far as they style. And the instant that those kind of, I guess, fell into our lap, where it's like, oh, this is something we want to support and get behind, I immediately was like, okay, I've got an idea for a spot that I want to put together. And we kind of were in the middle of a bunch of different things at Greyscalegorilla, and kind of wasn't in our time budget to tackle something like that. But I was just kind of enthusiastic about it. So I started working on it after hours, just as a fun something or other to put together. We might do a little bit of screen stuff on here, but I think if we do anything important, we'll do screenshots and link to them if there's anything that people need to specifically visualize. But
yeah, I think when we saw this pack, it was kind of like begging to be animated in some way like this. And yeah, I think you started messing around just like by building a landscape, right?
Yes, I went and I put together the entire scene. Let's see if I can quickly, I'm just going to share for a second. We'll put a screenshot. So I put together a layout where it's just a bunch of the models that I thought would be really cool to do in kind of a big scale. Actually, my original idea was going to be to take every single model, like all the food items and everything, and kind of zoom from this very small level and get bigger and bigger and bigger until eventually you're seeing this gigantic city and pyramids and clouds. And I started putting it together, and I ended up being kind of at the city scale, and I liked the look of that. So I never went to a tinier one because I thought I'd be kind of forcing it. Mm-hmm. And so that this bit was fun, and throwing together kind of just this proof of concept of like, okay, here's the scale and the camera kind of flying. We're going to see more and more of it. So I had put that together, and it was actually really straightforward. All the models are in the pack. All the models are set up in such a way where they're all kind of scaled about 400 by 400. Well, not less than that. They're about the size of a cube. They're designed to be kind of identical that way. So a fun thing that I like doing as far as laying it out would be to, in Cinema 4D, jump into the content browser and select all of the models and drag them in. And I wouldn't grab every single model of everything I was going to use. And they all, if you do that in the content browser, you grab everything, you drag it in, it's all going to be piled up on top of each other. And sometimes they can look a little bit cool and crazy if you use all the models. But I would quickly grab all of them and just type in to the X or the Z coordinate num, which is index, times about 400, just to give you enough breathing room. And it would go and it would grab every single model and stretch them out into space and kind of give me a relative idea of everything. And so my first step in this process was just to go through and be like, okay, maybe that truck is my base scale. So if I were to start, like there's a truck that's pretty small, but I'm going to scale everything else to that truck scale. And I just went through and did a rough pass of scaling every single object up to about the right size. And once I've scaled everything to what I think is the correct size, I just started laying them out in the scene, just seeing, you know, how it's scaled together and how packed it should be and whatnot. And based on me just kind of throwing together this rough layout, I started talking to you about it, and you were super on board.
Yeah, I think I'm trying to remember, like the first thing I saw was probably just like a pretty rough layout of like everything. And like, I think you had thrown like just about everything you possibly could at that one shot. And
that was a second pass.
That was a second pass.
Yeah, I had done that really kind of clean one with a little bit of everything. And then you're like, I like it. I think we should continue moving forward on it. You wanted to jump in for the rendering part, because I wanted it to look better than I was going to be able to get it to look. So as soon as you signed off, I was like, okay, I'm going to go and build the real one. And so I jumped into Cinema, and I immediately started doing a big, gigantic, fancy city layout. And unfortunately, I don't have any iterations of that particular one saved. I just saved over it. But it ended up being a lot more epic in scope. And it's sort of what we went with, but I had so much more. So if you watch the actual spot, it was that layout, but there was almost no blank space. There was trees everywhere. There's more city. There's just more everything. And you were like, I like it, but there's too much. And it's like, and I as soon as you said that, I was like, oh man, yeah. And it's like, there's nowhere to rest the eye. It's just super crazy. So I went immediately, just started like ripping trees out and deleting things. And a lot of the layout was pretty fun and straightforward to put together. We're not going to do any kind of a detailed breakdown here, but a lot of things with the trees, I just found all the trees that stylistically match what I want to go with from the model pack. And I put them inside of a cloner. And then I started drawing just rough spline outlines of like, I want some trees here, I want some trees over here, and just kind of splattering them all over the landscape wherever I wanted them. And I just threw that entire thing into a loft and then set the loft's, what do you call it? Like the cap subdivisions to quads, and then set that to a scale where I liked the density of it. And now I could just draw splines to get trees wherever I wanted to. A couple of effectors, a couple of random effectors to get random scale and rotation, push apart effectors so they're not quite bumping into each other. And boom, those trees are placed. And I did a lot of similar things where it's like, okay, we're going to do a bunch of buildings. So that's a cloner on a plane. And I could just delete out or do a selection tag so that I could place certain buildings manually, but other ones would be randomly distributed. Okay, all sorts of nice fall-offs. So a big goal here was that everything was going to kind of appear from nothing, scale on. So we had to...
Yeah, let's talk about that. I think like because I think that the art direction that we decided on early kind of dictated how we did everything from there on out. Everything from the camera move to the object.
Yes.
So we wanted to do like this, like almost like a stop motion-y vibe, but a bit more like a bit less sophisticated is what you would see from a top stop motion studio. So it has like that little bit of imperfection. And so Chris animated everything to kind of pop on, but then sort of move every once in a while. Like the animator came into the set to move something and accidentally bumped something else, or maybe something got like wasn't placed perfectly. And that sort of imperfection was really a big part of this. So talk about that, because when the first time that I saw it, I was kind of like, oh, it's interesting how you put how you created a building coming on and having it move. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, specifically, and actually this is something that we'll talk about maybe a little bit later on, because you and I had slightly different ideas about the way we wanted the final frame rate to be. And I'd still actually kind of like to see the other version, but we'll get to that. But what I was aiming for, and with the early passes especially, if anybody watching has ever seen any of the, how do you say it, Laika?
Laika.
Laika? Is it just Laika? Okay, the Laika animations. So stuff like Box Trolls and Coraline, and they got a couple others, and they're really good. And of course, they do like absolutely gorgeous stop motion animation. But something that I really love is at the either start of the credits or the end of the credits, there's a shot that you'll see where you see the animators in a time lapse doing the animation. And so you'll see the character kind of doing a like jump, 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 jump. But the animator, you can see like blurring around the screen doing all this stuff. And that's kind of a vibe I really liked. So something I was specifically going for is having a lot of things randomly moving, but having a high frame rate so you'd see these individual pops. And so from that point forward, I think I did a second pass where it wasn't so cluttered and everything, and I handed it off to you, and you recorded a camera move that you liked. So nothing was animated; it was the entire model.
Right. That's right.
The entire model existed. Everything's there, and I even like baked it down. I remember I was trying to figure out a good way of baking everything down so you could get like a real-time playback, and it actually runs quite well in the viewport, but it's not going to run in real time with thousands of models all in cloners, so that's not going to run super smooth. No, so I remember I was very
slow.
I was trying to figure out a good way of doing that, and I was even considering, I was doing stuff like throwing it into a Connect object, but I was actually running into limitations there because I was doing a lot of I would have the model and I'd create an instance of that model, and then an instance of that model, there'd be like two of them mirrored, so there'd be two. So maybe I put them in the cloner to make a row of them to make like the blocky bridges, and I put that instance of an instance in a cloner, and then that cloner would get instanced in the multiple places. So when you start layering up cloners as instances like that, when you go to start making things editable, you have to make them editable in a very specific way. And the scene was just getting so big that specific way was getting very, I guess, tedious. Whereas like, okay, I gotta go find all of the instances and delete that or make them editable, but some of those instances are cloners, so those cloners need to be made editable. So instead, I just turned off all the subdivision surfaces and exported it out as an FBX file. I was like, FBX, do the model, brought it back into Cinema, made sure the scale was the same, and I sent you the baked down FBX file, and I didn't have to think about any of those bits. And you sent me back a really nice camera that I think barely changed from that moment.
Yeah, I got the bake down scene, which I don't think I even knew that you did the FBX method. I think I just got the bake down scene. And yeah, I quickly kind of blocked out a camera move that I thought was sort of interesting, and I wanted it to show the the vastness of the landscape. And like whenever you're doing a shot like that, like the best thing you can do is to create depth in the shot. And the way that you do that is you have things at extreme foreground and things at extreme background. So that way you're getting a real sense of the vastness of the world that you're in. So it's important for me like to start the camera off in sort of an innocuous place, but have it go right by, I think, a tree. I made sure like I came real close to a tree, and then I swooped it down and came by the road and then kind of ended it. And I think I ended up using a future tool that we probably shouldn't talk about in too much detail, but we'll talk about it more in the months to come. But we have a specific tool that made this camera move even more beautiful and nice. And it turned out good. And so when I gave the camera back to Chris kind of saw what I was doing and that I wanted to get really close to some objects as we passed by them. And you tweaked some of the layout to kind of help me do that, right?
Oh yeah, this went into like the iterative process now where it's like, okay, we've got the layout for the most part and we've got the camera move. So it was turning into how is this going to animate on? And then there was a lot of like, oh, I'm going to make sure that there's a train in the opening bit. There's a little train that's going to show up right away. And I'm going to put something here to make that opening frame look good. At least that's what I'm attempting to do there. And at that point, it's like, okay, here's where the start point is. So for a lot of the animation, I had to get a lot more specific, but a lot of the animation is one gigantic effector. It's just a plane effector that has a spherical fall off, and that spherical fall off is enlarging to essentially keep up with the camera. I hand keyframed it. I had been thinking about building like an espresso rig where there was a start point, and based on the distance of the camera, it would be creating that radius, and I would have a slider to modify that to be closer or further away. I ended up just hand keyframing it. But all of that was working well, but there ended up being a couple little tricks where, like you said, you want to create foreground depth by having things, and you had made this very intentional move where the camera flew close behind this tree, but I was intentionally trying to animate everything so that we didn't see it pop into frame until after the camera had passed it. So I ended up separating out certain things to be animated separately. So like those trees popped on or were already there before the camera gets there, but then other things would pop in as the camera got past it. So that ended up being an interesting thing, separating out certain things like the railroad tracks and the street, the blocks that make up the street would appear on slightly before the vehicles that would be driving on them and things like that. So very similar spherical fall-offs. And eventually the entire scene got baked down into very clean, like all these buildings are in a cloner and all the trains are in a cloner. So at the end of the day, I think there's maybe just 12 cloners, and a couple of them just had slightly different spherical fall-offs. And that made for the vast majority of everything that was in the scene. So at that point is a lot of, I do a bunch of tweaks, do a bunch of things, send it over to you. You were doing render tests and material tests, and they'd go back and I'd tell you, okay, I just changed like 50 little things. I moved models around and changed it. And I kept pushing for like a tiny bit of, I don't even know what it is, because right now the buildings just pop into the scene, and they're popping in the scene by just scaling up from 0. Actually, a fun fact for everybody out there, I don't know if it's a bug, but there's a thing in Cinema 4D that if you use a certain combination of effectors and it has scaled down to 0, you can get some super cloner weirdness where things rotate, where something will suddenly rotate 90 degrees. And I don't know what causes that. And my fix is, instead of scaling down to 0, I scale down to 0.001. It's so tiny that if you're super close or if something's really close to the ground, you might see like a little ambient occlusion or something. But I never saw it pop up at all as a problem. But that's definitely a thing that I've run into. And luckily I remembered that was a solution.
So after they pop up, after they pop on, they move a little bit.
Well, actually, yeah. Well, that's what I was saying. Sorry, I was trying to get so that the buildings would have a little bit of like overlap where they kind of like overshoot and scale to their final position. Not something you're supposed to see, but more feel. But you liked it being a little bit more mechanical, where it's just like, boom, they're there. Like the artist placed the building in that spot, and now it is where it's supposed to be.
Yeah, I think that I still like that call, because to me, I don't want to see wood scale. It just like takes me out of it. Like I want to see wood sort of, even in this sort of stylistic world, behaves somewhat like wood, you know, where it's
Yeah,
not
that's what
like
convinced me. Yeah.
squashy and stretchy and stuff. But
When I had a gray render going, which is the way I was testing everything, mostly I was just doing in viewport stuff, like exporting as like hardware renderer. It's like, okay, the buildings are scaling up and they look really cool that way. And you're like, yeah, but they're going to be covered in like grainy wood and we're going to see that wood scaling. And it's like, yeah, that's a good point. Like that definitely pulls away from it a little bit.
I think that, you know, this is the first time you and I had ever worked together on like a production job, or did we do it before? I
Sort
can't.
of. There's that marble thing that we haven't done anything with that we are sort of going back and forth on.
Yeah,
So that has a similar kind of vibe where you and I were bouncing back and forth.
yeah, definitely. It's like when you're working with a really small team, in this case, just two people, it's a lot easier to kind of have these types of discussions and the fact that we didn't have a client, which is like
Yes.
amazing. Like that never happens. But yeah, it was a lot easier to kind of have these discussions and sort of like have this push and pull about what we think is right and what we think. And what's cool about working with somebody like Chris is that you're pretty open to the reasoning behind some of the decisions that we made. And I think that's really important when you're working with in a team, is that everybody needs to be open to the process and open to hearing each other out on ideas or tweaks or things, ways to make it better. Obviously within restrictions of the timeline and budget and all that. But yeah, that was something that I liked about this process, is that I think I got to know how you work a little bit more, and I think you got to know a little bit how I work a little bit more, which we just never really did at this scale before.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that was one of the main reasons that you were enthusiastic about it. Is like it was just getting to do a little bit of production, which we don't do a ton of at Grayscale Gorilla. We do a little bit where we do spots, and you've put together some spots, but those have almost been entirely you. So it was
Yeah,
fun.
it
It's
was
fun being
cool to
on a
work. It was cool to work with a TD again, somebody that like could make all that awesome stuff move around and do wild stuff.
yeah, and we'll get to the lighting and whatnot in a second. But like you're saying, eventually, so we didn't go with the buildings having a little bit of springiness to them, but we did, and I did add in a random effector, actually using, I think I was using the new R19 fall off feature. So it was a random effector,
With
so
the
it could
noise
go
fall off.
randomly. Yeah, it could go randomly positive or negatively on rotation. There's only like 1 or 2 degrees, like really tiny amounts, and then a little bit of positional wiggle. But then I was using the noise fall off, which is new in R19. So it was like a very high clamped noise where it's just like whenever there's an animated noise, and it's mostly a giant field of white, but every once in a while there's be a couple spots of black around. And if it caught a spot of black, it would suddenly do this little twitch. So that made it really easy to go and be like, oh, I want more of that. I want lots of that. I want it to be quicker. I want it to be more subtle. So just one simple effector that applied to like every single cloner made it super straightforward for that to work.
I feel like you should do a stop mo tutorial now, like maybe even using some of these elements, because I think that's something that comes up in production. Like I think in my career, I can think of at least 3 times where we had to do like fake stop mo and like have things kind of move a little bit and like imperfection and all that. I think that would be a cool tutorial. I think people would dig seeing that.
Yeah, there's definitely some fun bits on there. One of the fun things with this was getting to use a bunch of our tools, like because effectively every single tool we've ever made comes because something that we've been trying to do, we think of a cool way of solving it, or I'll make a very simple rig. It's like, oh, this could be developed into something bigger that is applicable to everybody and other people might want it. So we end up using our HDRs in this. We end up using an upcoming thing that we're working on that we can't really talk about. And I was also making an extensive use of Signal for it. A really fun part of this, one of my favorite bits, was just animating the trains and the cars. And what I wanted to do was have the cars, like I wanted that additional imperfection of a stop motion-y type vibe. So they're being moved forward via a plane effector. Or actually, that's not even true. They're run along a spline. It's really easy. I just drew some splines that were already how the roads were kind of being swept and or placed all the blocks. And all the trains and the cars were on that spline. and I made sure the splines were oriented correctly so the cars would be moving in two directions of traffic. And then the cloner just has an offset. You can drag an offset and they'll move forward. And if they hit the end, they'll pop back to the beginning. And so in this case, that's perfect. Exactly what we want. So using our tool Signal is a tool we made to do animations and automate that things and make it so that they're infinite. And this animation, how many frames did this end up being? I know it's a low frame rate, but the seed file is how many seconds long?
I think, well, it's 23 seconds long now, but that's with the end tag. And before that, it was longer because we were actually doing it at double frame rate. At one point, I remember getting a file that was 1,000 frames. And
yeah, I was gonna say I remember doing 1,000.
Yeah, so I think it then we chopped the frame rate down, and it was coming out at 500 frames. Thank God, because that took a while to render at 1,000 frames.
Well, and we ended up doing some of the decisions. I think end up being because of render time. So we'll definitely get to those. But using Signal on the vehicles moving, I wanted to go for an additional stop motion vibe, so that offset was being told to just constantly move forward. But in the newest version of Signal that came out maybe 6 months ago or so, we have some additional features, which, oh geez, what do we even call it? We used to call it quantize. It's not called that anymore. It's called like snapping or stepping. I think it might be stepping now. Wait, you can't
remember the name of your own?
Because I wanted to call it quantize, and we called it quantize forever. And then
was it step time? Maybe
it might be step. I'm checking now.
Now we have.
Oh yeah, it's called step. Okay, it's called step.
Okay. Good.
Quantize. That's why I'm confusing it.
At least one of us knew.
The stepping allows you to step via time or step via a parameter changing a certain amount. So what I did is I ended up using a signal tag to say, I want you to randomly step, let's say 3 frames. But then I added a second signal tag feeding back into that one where I was actually adding randomness to how much time was stepping. So it had a variation. So any given frame, the cars had a variation of frames of anywhere from 2, 3, or 4. So there's additional randomness in the the way the stop motion feels to make it feel a little bit more messed up. That felt a lot more pronounced when we were running at 30 frames a second or 24. I'm not sure what we were originally aiming for, but we ended up going with holding on 2s, running it I think on 12s.
Yeah,
or we're on 12 frames a second. So a lot of that kind of went away with that, which
it's still there. It's just more subtle, which I think is good. To me, like, I liked that too, but I didn't like seeing the cars like smoothly move backwards, or you know what I mean? Like I didn't mind seeing them smoothly move forward because that makes sense for the animator to have done that, but it wouldn't have made sense for the animator that was there on the set to move the same car backwards smoothly. It makes sense for them to bump it and have it maybe forget to move it on a frame. But it
wasn't smooth because the cars were always running on a minimum of 2s.
Yeah, I don't know. It was just something about it. It felt better. That particularly felt better at the lower frame rate to me. I guess because you're so used to seeing a car going a specific direction. I don't know. Just my brain.
But then it started getting to the point where you were really getting a lot of really cool look dev, and at this point, I was constantly being like, "I got a new file for you." You're like, "Okay, I guess
I'm gonna kill you."
The main file again, because I was doing things like I was like, "Oh, the trains are hovering a little bit above the track, and this other thing is like popping in weird," and then for like this one frame, the boat pops in and pops back out again because of the way it's moving and the circle's moving. So, and then I was doing things like I started adding smoke in. It's like, and I started adding smokestacks everywhere. It ended up being too much, and I pulled it back again. But we made it so the factory had smoke, and then I did like a little Elon Musk reference, and I put the rocket. I was putting the rocket somewhere because I like the rocket. I was like, I'm gonna put the rocket on the barge, and we're gonna have it blast off. I was like, Chad, you're gonna hate me, but I'm gonna blast off the rocket. You're like, I love that idea. Like, do it,
dude. That one, I think it like that moment when you added the smoke, that's probably the most excited I got because I was like, oh wow, that's great. And I can just imagine it be kind of stop motion-y and like it's like popping off instead of like just trailing or getting more transparent or something. And it had this really interesting vibe because it's one thing, like the clouds were one thing because a cloud made out of wood is interesting enough, but then like you take rocket smoke and like smokestack smoke and make that out of wood, and I can just imagine, my brain was like, and each one of them would be a slightly different shade of wood, and I'm like, oh, this is going to be so cool, and it turned out great.
Yeah,
So if
those
you,
turned out well. That also turned out to be the biggest pain in the butt eventually.
right, we'll
But
get to
it was
that.
really straightforward to put together. And I love, and even that the smoke are models from Happy Toolbox. And I use the flat bottom clouds for the sky, and then the really big fluffy ones for the smoke coming out. And so
Yeah,
I
tell
guess
people about how you did the smoke for both of them, because I think a couple people have already asked about the smoke.
well, initially I did it as straightforward as possible, which is, and because I knew these were really simple, there's nothing super crazy happening with them, so I did it as simple as possible. I grabbed the original old school Cinema 4D particle emitter, and then I put in a couple variants of the cloud, and I said, go ahead and emit at a certain speed up, and I put a big wind in the scene that would blow in one direction, and the rocket just had an emitter on the rocket, and when the rocket blasted off, when the rocket blasted off, it would just leave the particle behind as it moved upward, and then the wind would naturally kind of blow it off to the side a little bit. I might have even added a little bit of downward motion. It was mostly the rocket moving up. And then I keyframed, and I think this is where some of the trouble started happening. Anybody who's familiar with the old school particle emitter, you can't tell it how many particles to emit. You have to set a certain number of particles, and then you can animate the visibility. And then once we started animating the visibility, I think it started confusing some of the third-party renderers. So that ended up being a big problem. And we ended up running into a couple of those as far as the way we were approaching it. But as far as limiting it to smoke, you were moving on. I think we had actually jumped renderers maybe 2 or 3 times at this point. And every time there's a different problem.
Yeah,
so
we already went to the ended up in Arnold at that point. Like I had already leapt over one hurdle, and then yeah, the smokestack thing, or that wasn't the smokestack, wasn't the big problem. It was that damn rocket.
The rocket
problem. And it's weird.
Yeah, the smokestack was constant, but the rocket had to suddenly animate on at a particular time. Although I just had an idea pop in my head that we could have gotten around it with the old school way now.
Well, the rocket started off. We'll just stay on the rocket for a second because it's kind of an interesting problem. So the rocket was like, traditional C40 particles, which, by the way, I've never even used those before. So I just saw them in the scene. I'm like, okay, this is how he's doing it. And sometimes that's what happens. You get a scene from somebody and you start to work with it. And it was working fine in the viewport. At this point, I'd already moved from Redshift to Arnold. So I was pretty, and I'll rewind on that in a minute, but just to say on the rocket smoke. And what was happening was whenever we were sending when I was sending the scene file up to PixelPlow to render, it was not rendering the smoke coming out of the rocket. And I couldn't figure out what was going on. It was checking all the logs. It was just being really weird. So I'm like, okay, it obviously, the render farm needs to render it sequentially because it's not able to do the run up properly. Like without caching particles, how does the renderer know what's happening at frame 100 if it hasn't run up and done 0 through 99 of the frames, right? So I'm like, okay, cool. Let's just cache this out. So it's really weird, and I didn't know this, but it's not as simple as just like throwing a dynamics cache on the particle simulation. You actually you have to like do that through some weird submenu of the particle system. And that was the aha moment. Like, so everything was messing up and I was like pulling my hair out. In fact, I think I even had you rebuild it in X particles.
No, we rebuilt it twice. I don't even know. I don't remember which one we ended.
I think we went back to the regular one.
Well, you said you were having trouble with the regular particle system, and then I was like, okay, if the particle system is giving us trouble, you were like, do an X particles. I was like, no, particles is what got us into this mess. I'm going to build a cloner-based rig. So I made a spline, and I was cloning things on the spline, and the spline was just cycling them back up to the top, and there was the same fall off. So it kind of looked like an emitter, but there was no emission. Every cloner particle existed all the time. I don't remember. We built that rig. It was on my end completely working, but once again, something in the render farm did not like it. I don't remember what it was, but something didn't work.
Yeah, that one. Yeah, I don't know what happened with that either. I can't remember. But I remember getting the X particles one, and then realizing that PixelPlow didn't have the latest version of X Particles for that would work with Arnold. So I was like, damn it, like I can't win with this stupid missile. So I was at that point determined to figure out what went wrong with your original sim. And that's when I discovered that sub menu where you actually have to tell it to bake the particles. So I would bake the particles, and then I would cache the particles, and then I don't even know if this was even necessary, but I double cached it. So I cached the particle system, and then I even threw, I think, a MoGraph cache on that, because basically you were cloning geometry onto particles. So that was another thing that I needed to figure out, because it wasn't just the particle system; it was a cloner that was spawning clones on top of the particle position. So I had to bake it twice, and once I did that, it worked fine, and it was all good. So that was a hurdle that we had to overcome. But man, yeah, I mean, that was super frustrating.
So
But
let's
anyway.
let's rewind a little bit to the like the render look development and the process we were going through on there. We kind of just tackled all the technical hurdles we had as far as bouncing things back and forth, but there's a
Yeah.
certain point when I was just giving you scene files and you were making them look super sexy.
Oh, thank you, man. So the first thing, like, all the Happy Toolbox models come kind of pre subd'd out, meaning that they're all, under a subdivision surface object, so they get all smooth and stuff. Well, I knew, since I was going to, at the time, I thought I was going to be using Redshift, and I wanted to do all of the subdivisions at render time. I didn't want to have to deal with all of that happening in my viewport, and I didn't want to have all of these subdivision surface redundancies. So that was one of the first things. I asked Chris to give me everything outside of the subdivision surface, so they all came in pretty low poly and fast and pretty responsive. Then went through the process of adding Redshift tags to all of the objects and subdividing them at render time, all looking good. But during the process of doing the look dev in the beginning, before I had any animated assets, Redshift was doing just fine. Like, it was giving me the look I wanted. Speed was great, and that's really what I wanted to use this project as, like kind of like a test subject, because I knew it was going to be fairly complex in terms of amount of objects and animation and things like that. I knew that it would be something that we could either render on the farm, or I could render home if we needed to, whichever kind of came up. So that's why I started going down this Redshift path, and I was already getting some pretty good results. The issue came with Redshift when I got the animated assets back from Chris, because what I was dealing with were like frequent crashes, like really frequent crashes in Redshift. And the other ridiculously annoying thing was the refresh on the IPR. So what happens in the scene with all of these objects that are in cloners popping on and whatnot, it creates what's called a dirty flag. And I found this out later. And a dirty flag is telling the renderer, hey, something has changed. You need to refresh the IPR window because something changed. So even though I wouldn't change anything and everything is cached out, every time I moved a frame, every time I selected a camera, every time I selected anything, the entire scene would get resent to Redshift, which would take a good 2 or 3 seconds pausing, waiting for it to parse out everything, build the first few passes of the ray tracing, and just like before it delivers an image. And it got to be so annoying that it was kind of unworkable at that point. Between the crashes and that sort of thing going on, I was like, you know what, this is like making me angry. So I reached out to some of the Redshift folks and sent them some scenes, and I was like, listen, I really want to use this for this project, but I can't deal with this. This is like insane. Like, every time I advance a frame, I'm waiting like 10 seconds to see the IPR refresh.
Weren't you even sending them the file? It was like this really good, like, because you're always giving tons of feedback. You're one of the best beta testers ever, just because you constantly have ideas for what you want to see and why things aren't working and the way it should be working. And this turned into this primary example of like, okay, we're doing actual production here, and I'm running into these issues. Like, how do I get around it?
Yeah, I sent them the scene, and they were like, oh, okay. we'll take a look at it. And so immediately they were like, there's some sort of dirty flag going on here. Have you tried baking them out as Redshift proxies? And I'm like, okay, but just so you know, we're talking about hundreds of objects that are all animating. Each one of them is animating. And it's at this point in the game, we were at 1,000 frames long. So imagine rendering out proxies, like which are basically baking out the geo into sort of like an Alembic file or something, but it's native to Redshift, it's faster, whatnot. So I said, okay, I'll do that. I'll do it because I want to know what's wrong. So I baked out the entire scene into several Redshift proxies based on the categories that we had set up in the scene file: buildings, trees, whatnot. And this took a long time, and I think it was like, I want to say it was like 15 or 20 gigs at this point. And I uploaded them all to Dropbox for the Redshift guys to look at. And it still was doing it. So it was never solved, and they never were able to tell me what it was and why it happened. And it really kind of bummed me out because this was a pretty typical production scenario. A lot of assets, a lot of animation. It's a single camera move.
Well, essentially, it's Cinema 4D and a bunch of cloners. It's almost what Cinema 4D is built to do. So
exactly. So I kind of made the choice at that point. I wasn't too far down the path, and it's not that complex of a scene in terms of lighting and shading. So I was like, you know what?
One shader in the whole thing.
So what I did is I quickly stripped the last scene I think that you gave me. I stripped out everything, and I just opened it up in Arnold and started like bopping around the timeline to see if it was responsive. And Arnold didn't flinch. Arnold was just like, the IPR would start up right away, not a problem. Change to this frame, IPR starts up right away. And it was like I had been walking in mud, and then suddenly I'm like on a hardwood floor. I'm like, whoa, hey, this feels pretty good, like moving around stuff. And it was like, okay, this is how I'm gonna finish this job. So once that was done, it was a matter of taking all of the materials that I had made in Redshift and quickly making them in Arnold. I was using HDRI Link, which was great because then all I had to do is like, okay, I use this map in Redshift. I'm going to use this map in Arnold. And for those of you that have bounced around between the two, there's actually a 30-degree difference in the rotation of the dome light in Redshift from the skylight in Arnold.
Oh, that's interesting.
So once you know this like little key, like, oh, it's negative 30 degrees on top of everything, you can get a perfect match between HDRI Link in Arnold or Redshift. So I got and I was using, I think, one of the images from Paradise, I believe, that has a really nice sun and a bunch of other like little area lights and stuff, kind of giving me little bounces and things of that nature. But that's all one wood shader.
I was gonna say, you had one shader. Did you? And somebody has a question in the chat saying, did you have any kind of texture conversion process? But I think with just one shader, you just manually rebuilt it, right?
Yeah, that was another thing going into it. I wanted to see if I could, and this was just like a nerdy challenge for myself. I wanted to see if I could do this entire shot with one wood shader and use only variants to all my different variance techniques to get different looks out of each piece. So that's what I did. So in Redshift, I had done that. And it was actually even easier and more robust in Arnold because Arnold has this amazing random utility where not only will it give each object in your scene a random color as like a user data, almost like pass, but you can also change the seed of that at any point in your shader tree. So I would use that to offset the texture. I would use it to offset the color. I would use it to offset the glossiness of every piece of wood. So every piece of wood in there is unique in its own way. The only thing that it shares is that it's pulling the same wood texture map, and everything else is completely random. So the color correction of each one is a little bit random. The glossiness is a little bit random. The bump intensity is a little bit random. And I built that specifically so that you could get what looks like at least 15 or 20 different wood shaders, but you're only doing it with one. And then I could just change the seed. So I split out seeds for every parameter. So I'm like, you know, I like this one, but this one, I wanted the tower, like the water tower, to have slightly different shades of wood on the sandwich pieces. So I would just keep hitting seed, you know, change seed until I found one that I liked. And I'm like, that looks pretty good. And then I'd move on. And then came the time of like building out the passes. And then I built like, in Arnold, of course, you can build out crazy complex, but really easy to set up mats for everything. So I had mats for all the different categories. So there's tree mats, there's building mats, there's city build, like the streets and cars had a mat pass.
And then that was really, yeah. And I had tried to set the scene up for you as cleanly as possible so that you had like a building cloner. So you could just be like, okay, everything in there, that's a building.
Yeah. And I use layers a lot. So I'm a huge layer nerd. And I moved, Chris had given me like everything really well organized. And I just started dumping all that stuff into layers. And then what I like to do is I work in layer color mode almost all the time, so that I have when I open up my scene, I can instantly tell what is what based on the color of the object. Here, I'll share
I've actually never done that before.
I'll share my screen.
I literally only use layers when I'm creating a rig for a character. It's the only time when you want to hide so many of the things to just get at the meat of the controls. Only time I use layers.
Yeah, I use it all the time. All right, so here's the scene.
So you've got like a rainbowy Minecraft looking world there.
Yeah, so everything is in layers over here. So I've got the trains, I've got lights, cameras, everything in layers. So that way I can easily turn things on and off. I can see what's going on. And then if you come over to the options here and you turn on the layer color, it allows you to see whatever color your layer is will show in your viewport here. And then of course I've got everything sort of dumbed down to bounding boxes, shaded bounding boxes, so that I can like really quickly zip around my scene. And even then it's not super fast, because you got to remember there's a lot of things animating.
There's thousands of objects in this scene. There's thousands of just trees in that scene.
Yeah, so just like working like this, it was pretty responsive. And if I fire up Arnold here, let me just change my scale to Arnold doesn't really care. I mean, it takes a second for it to initially load. Watch, it'll crash during this.
Oh, that'd be great.
It would be totally something that would happen too. Actually, maybe I didn't push it. Did I push it?
I don't know.
Oh, yeah,
but
I didn't push it. So there you go. So now it's starting. So once it kind of loads in, it'll take a minute. Let's see what is it doing?
It's loading up megabytes. I don't know what that is.
You know what? It's there's some textures that have moved since I started this job, so it's not going to work. So I apologize, I didn't have that ready, but yeah, it's very responsive this way. But using layers is like my favorite thing, because I can just come in here and be like, you know what? I don't want to see any of the models in my viewport. I only want to see the ground, or I want to see all of them, but I don't need to see them in my object lister because I only want to do this. And I think I even created, no, I didn't actually create any bookmarks, but I was going to go in and like create some bookmarks based on the different objects. And Chris was nice enough to give me a selection object here. So if I did need to select all the cloners, I could do that pretty easily right there. So it's always good to kind of go in and like clean house before you start really diving in. So this is great and this was awesome, but it became kind of a problem when things would change, because Chris doesn't have Arnold. It was a lot of like, okay, so what did you change? And then I'd be like, okay, I'll copy and paste that back in. And hindsight, I think probably what we should have done is maybe, I don't know. Like, what do you think? Like,
I don't know. To a certain degree, it's almost like we should have had a master file on Dropbox or something. So I could have been opening up your file. I wouldn't have been able to render, but when I went to make changes, I could be like, hey, don't change anything for a little bit. I'm going to update all these animations and then give it back to you. And then it would have been off the same master file. Because I remember there was one point when I didn't realize you were doing that workflow, and I kept giving you a new pass and a new pass and a new pass. I thought you were just copying render settings in. and
Mm.
like dropping a material on. I didn't know you had it all super reorganized. And there's one point when you sent like a small render test, and I was like, why? It was like, why does the trade look like that? I fixed that like 4 or 5 versions ago. And you're like, and that's when you explained the entire process and that you were having to do all those things manually. And meanwhile, every time I gave you a new copy, I had made like dozens of changes throughout the scene.
Yeah. So that's always a good idea to communicate. Like yeah, I think had we been like, okay, how are you doing this? And then, okay, how are you doing this? And then we could have like, coalesced a little bit more. But like, I feel like we did pretty good given the fact that you don't even have Arnold on your system or Redshift. And, we were passing assets back and forth pretty easily.
I remember
But
one of
yeah.
the best and worst part of working with Chad on a project like this is when you finally sat down, and it was pretty late into the process, and you were like, all right, we are doing like the final look dev here. Like, what is the color of the background? Where is the light striking? What is the tone of the wood? And the problem here is you were giving me a render like every 2 minutes, and they would be completely different colors, completely different lighting, like a completely different tone of wood. But all of them looked gorgeous. It's like, oh, here's a good, like, oh, look at this one. Like, oh my God, you nailed it. Perfect, done. And you'd be like, what about this one? It's like, oh man, now I don't know between them. It's like, wait, here's 2 more. It's like, oh no, what do we, like, I don't even know anymore now. Like now you just have to choose again because I can't trust my eye on it.
That's the fun part, man. Like I love doing that. Like I think if you've probably learned one thing from working with me is that I am not afraid to completely pivot and like go a completely different way with the look or anything. And I like that because I feel like you got to be kind of open to the process and like try a bunch of stuff and see what looks good. And sometimes I think at one point we played around with like it being a color.
Yeah,
Like
we ended with a very kind of natural sky type world, but you went to color world for a while.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking the whole thing was like on a colored sweep, and that is kind of where it was in the beginning. And then I was like, I don't know, man. Like I'm not feeling the scale, so I brought in some environment fog, and once I brought in environment fog and more of like a daylight situation, I was like, man, this looks like Zootopia. So I watched Zootopia again, and I was like, I want to do Zootopia, man. Like that looks like way more fun. So then that's what brought me to like a more natural sky color and just like the color grade and everything. I just kind of took it in a bit more of like the Zootopia world, which I thought was kind of fun. But I left the white floor because anything else that I did on the floor just like drowned everything out.
Yeah, it
Like
made it really muddy.
yeah, so I tried like a color down there, like a green, because I thought maybe it's like grass or something, and that looked weird. And then I tried actually a wood. I tried a different kind of wood, and it was like wood on wood, and like nothing. Everything was just like muddy, like you said. And yeah, it just seemed to fit best with the white, and so we just went with it. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, no, I thoroughly enjoyed the project. It was fun going back and forth on it. It was fun wrapping it up. And then we even finished it a couple of weeks ago, and then we were like, oh, we're going to go super crazy on the sound design, or what do we want to put there? And I know I was being kind of picky about the music.
Oh, we skipped over some stuff too.
Yeah, but we're reaching near the end of it, and I wanted to make sure we get some questions in from people.
Oh yeah.
We can go a little long.
We used Pixel Plow to render it with Arnold, and it was fantastic. It was like so easy. And then it was comped in Blackmagic Fusion, and all the color grade was done in there with a little bit of my own color grade and the Gorilla Grade LUTs that we sell on our site. But yeah, that's all I wanted to finish that part up.
Yeah. So let's take a look at the questions. Christopher's asking if we ran into the classic, I don't know, what do you want to do? I don't know, what do you want to do kind of problem. I think we lucked out this time because I had a very specific idea of something I wanted to tackle, and I just started working on it, not talking to anybody else. So Chad didn't see anything. He didn't even know I was doing anything until I gave him a fairly solid idea. And there's a bunch of like, I was like, okay, Chad, I want to do this, but I don't know the final look or camera move or anything, but I want to have all these things animate on. And even that, my idea had been that the camera was going to fly in from the front and everything's going to scale and get bigger and bigger and bigger. And we ended up starting in the middle of the city and pulling out from it. So when you gave me the camera move, it was actually the complete opposite of what I was expecting, but it was such a gorgeous camera move. As I was, okay, I'm sold. So I guess we had a fairly solid, like we had that, we've talked a lot about like blue sky problems, and we actually didn't have that problem here because the entire thing was inspired from a specific idea I had. And I was hopefully I was super open about, okay, what do we do from there? Because I wasn't locked on anything except I want to do a cool spot with all these models.
Yeah, we also didn't really overthink it. Like once we kind of landed on once I saw what you had done, and I was like, oh, let me just try a camera in here, and that kind of came together pretty well. And then we just didn't overthink it. Like we just were like, okay, this is working. Let's just keep going this direction. And it's really not like ultra complex of a concept. It was like a camera move that ends on the city and like, you know, shows the variety of all the different models that you get when you get this pack. And it was something that just was supposed to be fun, show the variety, be kind of in the art direction and feel of the pack itself. And so, yeah, we were lucky in that Chris had the great idea already. So we just kind of was like, all right, let's just build off that. Let's just do that, which is awesome because then you don't have to waste a bunch of time like, oh, what do you want to do? I don't know. What do you want to do?
Well, we also intentionally kept the scope small. Like we've got other people around on the team, and we're just like, okay, we're gonna keep this quiet and kind of a secret, and then unveil it that it's a cool, fun project. If we're working on this after hours, we're doing what we want with it.
Yeah, we have another one like that too that we need to finish.
Yeah, that one's crazy.
That one's definitely we gotta get.
And they might not ever see the light of day, but we can always tease out wasted hours. But man, I've got hours of recorded video for that, so we'll have to see if we do something with it.
Yeah, we owe it to ourselves to do something with that.
Nick Donlon is asking what our timeline was start to finish. We didn't give ourselves like a deadline. It was just something we were working on. I started working on it. We were already going to launch the product, so it wasn't going to be before the product. So we didn't have that hard deadline coming up on us. So we had a little bit of freedom there. But I don't think. Yeah, I mean, it was like maybe like 3 weeks of active kind of like tinkering around and jumping back and forth, maybe.
Oh, there's a good way for me to check. I'm just going to check my project dates.
Okay.
I think it's probably like 2 weeks, I want to say.
Oh, is it that short?
But then we took some time away from it, and then we came back to it, or at least I did. Let's see, where is it at? Yeah, it looks like, yeah, the first saved projects I think I had were from 1013 or around 1014, and then the last.
Yeah, I tinkered with that beforehand. Like you didn't do anything until I had gotten the whole giant landscape built out. So I probably had been tinkering for like 4 days or so before that.
So, and then the last one that I did, I think was like 1023. So about 10 days of my time.
And then, yeah, we've already been tackling a bunch of the render farm problems we were getting, just baking things out. I know that you were talking about baking all the stuff out in Redshift, and there's one point when we were trying to solve the problem. I was trying to solve the problem at my end, and I was taking all the cloners and baking them out. And it's when we were at 1,000 frames. And once they were all baked, I think that might be where that 15 gig number came in, because I was like, okay, I synced the files up, and you're like, these were 15 gigs. I can't send this over to Pixelplow. This is ridiculous.
Yeah, dude. Like that was the other thing too. Like you can't, like when the Redshift guys were telling me like, oh, just, bake out these giant proxies. It's like, well, yeah, that's easy for you to say. But when you're trying to upload gigs of data to a render farm, that takes a really long time. And it's just not economical. It just doesn't make sense at that point. So that was like, I was a bit mad about not being able to use or stick with Redshift, but I'm happy. I feel like this has happened to me before on one of the GSG spots. I started off in Redshift and I ended up in Arnold because Arnold is so bulletproof, and it's not the fastest renderer out there, but it is solid, and like you can send it to a farm and it's going to work.
I think that you're understating that. I think there was that the most recent spot you put together, which was like the advertisements with the cool DVD boxes flying into the box in reverse. I thought I swear you switched renderers like 4 times on that. You're like, all right, I'm doing Redshift. Oh, that didn't work. I'm switching to Arnold. Oh, I'm having a problem in Arnold. You know what? Maybe I can do it in Redshift.
I can't.
No. And I think for a second you're even like, I'm thinking about jumping into Octane to try and do it that way. Like there was a bunch of jumping around on one of them where you're like, I'm gonna explode.
Yeah, I'm trying to
Switching renderers.
remember what it was. I'm trying to remember that one and why and what. Yeah, I can't remember that. I don't remember that one. On honestly, I do remember switching. I don't remember why. I do
Yeah.
remember why on the Gorilla Grade spot with the cameras and stuff. I switched to Arnold because at that point Redshift wasn't supported on Pixelplow, and I needed to get it done, and I wasn't about to sit there and watch my machine render for 4 days straight. Um,
Especially when playing at the SIGGRAPH three
yeah,
day.
so like, no, that wasn't going to happen. So yeah, and honestly, if you're not doing really complicated stuff, and you don't have as many objects as we do, and they're not all animating, then yeah, probably Redshift would have worked fine. But
Well, it's the danger of like these renderers all work really well if you're doing daily renders.
right,
If you got these third party renders, like, oh look, I threw a sphere in, it looks great. I did this. Oh look, I copied a building in. Cool, that looks good. Like, and then now you get a client and it's like, oh, I need an entire city. It's like, oh, look at all these brand new problems that I didn't know existed, and now things need to be baked, and this has to change. I mean, I'll say from my end, because I haven't even really dabbled in the third party renderers, but all of the things that I was doing in cinema and I'd send it to you and then they just wouldn't work in the renderers. It was getting like, oh, come on. Like everything I love about being parametric, we just couldn't carry any of it over. It was so frustrating. Everything had to be made editable. Everything had to be baked down. We had to cache so many things. It's like everything that's parametric about the scene is now gone. And like anything that could be merged into one model, we were trying to do that just to keep the file sizes down and keep it moving a little bit faster. So
yeah, I don't.
my workflow being optimized for parametric Cinema 4D workflow, suddenly having it that plug into a different pipe, like the nozzles of those two pipes are very different. So you had to
have adapters, little adapters that go into them. Yeah, that's the problem. I mean, so I don't have the deep history of the parametric workflows that you do in Cinema 4D. So I'm a little bit like, whichever, But yeah, the cracks in the armor of third-party renderers show themselves when you stress test them on a real job. It's like one thing to say, oh yeah, how long did that take, that daily render? But when you do a real job, and this obviously, well, we didn't have clients. If we had clients, then this would have been a lot more stressful. But luckily, we didn't have that. But we still tested it in a production scenario, and I ended up using Arnold, and that's because it was the most rock solid and worked. And that's the truth. And if that changes, great. But right now, if people are like always asking me like what render they should use, I'm always like, well, what do you make it? Like, are you gonna push it? Is this going to be a type of job that you would do? Then you'll probably want to look at Arnold because it's more rock solid. It's not going to buckle under these pressures. It's not going to fail. But if you're not, like you just do little things or daily renders or maybe stills or something, then the other renderers might be better for you. And I'm sure Redshift will fix some of these issues. At least I'm hoping. They have my scene file, and I'm hoping that that they can sort through it and figure out these dirty flags.
So,
which is such a weird name.
Yeah. If I had to sum up what I think your impression of the renderers are right now is, I think that Redshift does everything that Octane would do for you, except you like Redshift better. Like you think Redshift does it better. And I feel like your heart is with Redshift right now, and you love how quick it iterates and the tools, and it's got lots of things you really like. But then, like, yeah, when you go and you stress test it, Redshift isn't quite what you need it to be at that moment. And so you go back to what seems to be a rock solid thing where you're getting the beautiful render, even if you're brute forcing a little bit with Arnold.
Yeah, it's like that car analogy. Like, if I'm in the mood to like just drive fast and I'm just like, whatever, gas prices, I don't care. to hell with everything, but just driving really fast, I'll be in Redshift. If I need to, like, I don't
And that's when you're
know,
in your sports car and you want to turn all the heads.
yeah, and if I need to like drive my parents to the airport and it's started snowing out and I have to get them to this flight, I'm not getting in that car. I'm getting in this, like, I don't know, Canyonero. I'm getting in the Canyonero and like gonna drive over a whole city or through a forest or something, and that's Arnold. So it's just about what is going to work. And I almost always, when I'm doing like heavy production, will come back to Arnold because it's just so stable and it just works. And there are things that I'm doing now which are all in Redshift because I need that speed. I need to iterate. I need to see what it's going to look like immediately. So it's just, yeah, those are kind of like which car keys do I grab?
Yeah, but we're already running a little bit long. I just want to do a little bit of wrap up here. We got some other questions from people, but they're a little bit more general topics. So keep an eye out for maybe the next big AMA that we do where it's more general questions. This one was very specific about this project. Also, this was sort of a little experiment here. We've never done a project breakdown. I would love to see comments from you guys about if you like this format, if this is kind of a cool type of topic for us to approach, do a breakdown. I think we tried to keep it very audio friendly, but talking about a project breakdown, at least everybody will hopefully have at least seen the project before watching or listening to the podcast. That would be probably pretty helpful. But I'd love to see comments if you like this format, if you don't like this format, because, and who knows what kind of projects and processes and things we could break down along these lines. So that would all be really fun. If you guys haven't checked out the Happy Toolbox models, I do want to say how of all the problems we had, I didn't have any problems with the models themselves. They're so light. Like you turn off all the subdivision surfaces and like I have thousands of items in the scene and Cinema 4D would take like 2 seconds cache and I could move the camera around in real time, even with all the stuff in cloners. Like they're just simple and clean and fun and they all work together really nicely. And even like the pile of blocks, if you watch the spot, I built like bridges and roads and train stations. There's all these things built out of the blocks just for fun. So the model pack itself was, it's the reason I wanted to make the spot, but they did not disappoint as far as making something nice and stylized quickly.
And they're all UV too. They're all, the UVs are, even though I didn't actually use the UVs, I did everything with triplanar mapping, but the UVs are there and they're great. So
yeah. So thanks everybody for watching, and we'll probably see you guys next week for another GSG podcast. So bye-bye, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.